Just wanted to give you guys a quick review, since you guys liked the video. I know some of you guys wasn't able to make it last night to the little review session that we had, but I wanted to still give you guys a quick review, just, so you can have it before you take your exam, right? So we're just going to go over a few things. So chapter 13, we went over the nervous system and nervous tissue. There's going to be a few things that we want to remember, specifically the anatomical subdivisions of the nervous system, right? So the subdivisions of the nervous system, we're going to have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, right? And so we also want to remember that in the central nervous system contains only the brain and the spinal cord, right? The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And of course, all the other nervous tissue outside of the central nervous system, outside of the brain and the spinal cord, consists of the peripheral nervous system, right? But remember the anatomical subdivisions of the nervous system, again, being the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. More specifically, with the central nervous system, remember that it only contains or consists of the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And we want to remember that in the peripheral nervous system, we're going to have sensory information being brought toward the central nervous system, okay? We're going to have that sensory information, right, coming towards the central nervous system, okay? And again, if you see a star or something like that, you're going to want to remember that, okay? All right, next. Well, if I can go next. This always happens, right? Well, there we go. Well, we want to remember that neurons are those nerve cells that are going to be responsible for the transfer and processing of information in that nervous system, okay? Remember that neurons, right, those nerve cells, they're going to be responsible for the transfer and the processing of the information in the central nervous system, okay? Now, we have neuroglia. Those are going to be the supporting cells that are going to protect those neurons, right? And the first one is the astrocytes. Right, the astrocytes, they're going to make up the blood-brain barrier, right? They're going to prevent, right, drugs and things from getting into the central nervous system, right? From like outside of the body, right? So it prevents drugs and other circulating material, right, from the common circulation into the central nervous system. It's not going to be able to get past this barrier, this blood-brain barrier, made up by these astrocytes, okay? And then you have oligodendrocytes, right? Oligodendrocytes, they're going to form that myelin sheath, right, over the axons, okay? They're going to form that myelin sheath over the axons. And we got to remember that those areas with mostly myelinated axons, they're going to be called white matter. Remember, in the central nervous system, white matter, right, is going to be the area that is covered by the myelinated sheaths, right? Those axons that are going to be covered by the myelinated sheaths. And we've got to remember that myelin is going to be made up of phospholipids, right? That myelin sheath that surrounds that axon is going to be made up of phospholipids, right? And that's what gives it that white color, okay? And we got to remember that gray color, right? These are going to be areas that don't have the myelinated axons, right? The gray matter is going to come from the cell bodies, right? The nissl bodies, those clusters of ribosomes, right? That are going to be in the cell body of the neuron. So they're going to be gray matter when you look at the neural tissue under a microscope, right? And we have the other microglia, or the other neuroglia, and that's going to be microglia. right? Those are going to be those phagocytic type of cells. They're going to scavenge and look for debris, remove those unwanted substances, right? And specifically, just look at the word. It's microglia, right? So we know these are going to be the smallest, right? Smallest of the neuroglia, okay? Right? These are going to be the smallest of the glial cells, right? Microglia. So remember that. Just micro gives you that understanding that it's going to be the smallest ones, okay? And again, they're going to be those phagocytic cells that are going to be able to remove cell waste. Now, ependymal cells, right? Ependymal cells produce cerebral spinal fluid, right? Ependymal cells produce cerebral spinal fluid, right? They make up a cellular lining called the ependyma, right? This is going to be the ependyma, okay? And they're able to produce the cerebral spinal fluid that you're going to see in the brain, right? And that you're going to see in that central canal of the spinal cord, right? The cerebral spinal fluid is going to line the ventricles in the brain, right? Those lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and it's going to line that central canal of that spinal cord, okay? So when we're looking at myelination outside of the central nervous system, right, we're going to be in the peripheral nervous system. This is where we have those Schwann cells. The space in between them, right, the space in between these myelin sheaths are going to be nodes, okay? The space in between them are going to be nodes. Those are going to be spaces that are unmyelinated, okay? So they don't have a sheath, right? They don't have that phospholipid myelin sheath covering that axon, right? So remember, it's going to be a node. Okay. Well, let's just do that, right? And so we also want to look at the other neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system. So we talked about the Schwann cells, right? They're going to cover the axons, right, with that myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. We also have satellite cells, right? Satellite cells, they're going to surround cell bodies of the peripheral neurons, which are going to be found in ganglia. Remember, ganglia is just a cluster of cell bodies, right, in the peripheral nervous system. But we want to remember that satellite cells, they're going to surround those cell bodies, right, protect them, right? They're supporting cells. So they're going to protect them, okay? So they're going to protect these cell bodies of the peripheral nervous system. Okay? So let me be able to write on there, right? Okay. So when we're looking at a synapse, remember a synapse is a junction between a neuron and another cell. At a chemical synapse, the neurons are going to communicate via their neurotransmitters, okay? This is how these neurons are going to communicate with each other. This is how these neurons are going to communicate with other type of cells, such as skeletal muscles or glandular cells, right? We also want to remember, of course, the most known one or the most used one is going to be the acetylcholine. However, serotonin, right? Serotonin is important. This is going to be the most common neurotransmitter that is going to be lacking among patients suffering from depression. Okay, so we want to remember that. Yeah, sure, we know acetylcholine is going to be that most abundant neurotransmitter, but that serotonin is extremely important, right? Because it is the most common neurotransmitter that is going to be lacking among patients that's suffering from depression. Okay. And then in chapter 13, chapter 14, we went over the spinal cord and spinal nerve. So we want to remember that there's going to be meninges. There's cranial meninges and there's spinal meninges, right? The layers of the meninges are going to be the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, okay? Remember that the dura mater is going to be the most outer layer, the arachnoid mater is going to be the middle layer, and the pia mater is going to be the most inner layer, directly on the organ, right? So directly on, whether it's the brain, the cranial meninges, or it's going to be directly on the spinal cord, right? Almost like a visceral type of layer, right? And so within that arachnoid mater, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, Lord. Within that arachnoid mater, sorry, let me try to trying to write on the screen. Okay, there we go. So, and you can, I don't know if you can still see that though, but let's discard that. Okay, I'm not sure why I can't write on the screen. There we go. So remember that the subarachnoid space, right? That subarachnoid space is going to contain fluid, right? And that fluid is going to be cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, remember that subarachnoid space right here is going to contain cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Now, looking at spinal nerves, so looking at a nerve, right? It's going to be 3 layers of it. You're going to have the epineurium. Okay, the epineurium is going to be that tough, fibrous sheath that forms the outermost layer of the peripheral nerve. Okay, and I want you to remember that the endoneurium, right, the innermost layer of the connective tissue fibers, is going to be isolated by fibrocytes and is going to surround each axon. But remember, endo is going to be the innermost. Okay, epi is going to be that outermost layer. Okay, so that's how we're able to remember that like that. Remember, also discussing the nerves, the sciatic nerve is going to be the largest nerve in the body, right? That sciatic nerve is going to be the largest nerve in the body. Okay. And looking at chapter 15, or chapter 16 rather, we want to remember that the anterior pituitary also means the adenohypophysis, right? The adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary. So if you have a question that says, oh, what is another word for adenohypophysis? We're going to need to know it's pituitary, anterior pituitary, right? If you need to know, well, what do we mean by neurohypophysis? That's posterior pituitary gland, right? Or posterior pituitary, right? And remember, the posterior pituitary gland is going to release ADH and oxytocin, okay? The posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, because you'll see a question that says, oh, but what's going to be released by the neurohypophysis? We're going to need to know it's ADH and oxytocin, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. Okay, I want to make sure. There's some things in the endocrine system that you want to remember as well, right? Let me make sure we see it. Give me 1 second. It should be next, right? So remember that the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland is called the adenohypophysis, whereas the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis. Specifically about the posterior lobe, is going to release ADH and oxytocin, right? So remember that. And the pancreas, right? Remember that it's the beta cells that produce insulin, right? It's the beta cells that produce insulin in the pancreas, right? Also, along with this endocrine system, remember that the lobes of the thyroid gland are going to be connected by the isthmus, right? So remember that. The lobes of the thyroid gland are going to be connected by the isthmus. Remember that thyroid gland was, oh Lord, like a shield, right? And the isthmus is going to contain this, or connect this lobe to this lobe, right? Okay. And then remember that little small pineal gland right in the back of the hypothalamus, that little small pineal gland is going to be able to produce melatonin, right? That pineal gland is going to be able to produce melatonin. Okay. And so the erythropoietin, right? Erythropoietin is going to be a kidney hormone that stimulates the red blood cell production by red bone marrow, or by the bone marrow, okay? So remember that the erythropoietin is going to be a kidney hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, okay? And so in the next video, I'm going to actually go over cardiovascular system in the rest of the chapters, okay?